Happy to. Is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Russell Jordan, a member of this committee. Today's date is April 13th, 2022. It is 1:20 p.m. and I'd like to call the meeting to order. And the first item, I guess, would be a roll call of members.
Okay, I will take care of that. I'm just, Mr. Jeff Jones,
Here.
Mr. Russell Jordan,
Present.
Richard Gonzalez.
Okay.
Receiving communications.
We fired all our citizens.
Well, then, on item number 5, then, I guess is the meat of the meeting, would be discussion and presentation of a floodplain study of Zagate and Manadas Creeks.
Mr. Chairman, it's John Porter. So thank you everybody for being able to make it. So we recently got a grant from Texas Water Development Board, and from the Water Development Board, we have Anita with us, and then the consultant that's going to be doing the work is Eric, and he'll be going over he's got a presentation, and then he can answer questions. But yeah, this will explain to the committee and also allows the public to learn more about this floodplain study that we're going to conduct for Manadas and Zagate.
Fantastic.
Eric, if you want to introduce yourself, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Okay, great. Yes. So thank you, everybody. My name is Eric Scheibe with Scheibe Consulting. We were able to help the city with this grant application, and ultimately were selected by the city to assist with this very interesting project. I'm going to turn my camera off. I wanted you all to all see me, but I'm on my phone and my battery's going down. So if I turn my camera off, then it'll save my battery. And anyways, I'm going to transition over to a PowerPoint slide. So let me do that right now.
Yes, it's coming.
Okay. So this project is a flood control, basically a drainage master plan of the Manadas and Zagate Creek watershed. I was visiting with John Porter and other folks at the city several years back about some of the drainage issues that have plagued the city for quite a long time. And with the recent Water Development Board Flood Infrastructure Fund money, it looked like a great opportunity to do a nice cost share. We were able to get 90% funding for this project by the Texas Water Development Board, and all that came about from the '86 legislature, which post-Hurricane Harvey, the legislature allocated approximately $750 million to drainage projects, and they broke this funding into 4 categories. Category 1 projects are planning studies. Category 2 are design and construction. I don't really remember what 3 and 4 are, but it's something like flood warning and other activities of that nature. This map here illustrates the different projects throughout the state that were approved through this infrastructure fund. Anita with the Texas Water Development Board is on this call, and she'd be able to answer, any other questions pertaining to this overall program. But what the Water Development Board is wanting to do is anywhere where there isn't an existing drainage master plan, they wanted to initially fund those. That's why they called them Category 1. And then they're moving, once the drainage master plans are finalized and construction projects are identified, then those would then roll into a future Category 2 application. So this is kind of a long-term program. This is also being built into the regional flood planning effort, which some of you may be aware of, and that's along the Lower Rio Grande Regional Flood Planning Group. And I know Laredo is participating in that. I believe there's some members of the city that are on that board, and it spans the lower Rio Grande from, basically midway up the Texas, border of Mexico down to the Gulf of Mexico. Previous studies done on the Zagate Creek and Manadas Creek are back in 2010. There was a Texas Water Development Board flood protection planning study dated 2010, and it focused on a portion of the Zagate Creek watershed, but it did not focus on the entire Zagate Creek watershed, which this project will focus on all the tributaries, etc., and I'll go into a little more detail on that. Then the Manadas Creek, the last time it was studied was in 2004, and that was a FEMA effort. So some of this, as you can see, is somewhat dated, anywhere from 10 to almost 20 years old. Something to keep in mind is the level of development, 20 years ago is significantly different in Laredo than it is now, and that obviously adds to additional runoff, additional flood risk, etc. This is a map that illustrates the meat of the project area. So the primary focus of this project is on the Manadas and Zagate Creek, but we're also going to be doing a community outreach for the various watersheds that are within a certain Huf boundary, which that's just a fancy word for a larger watershed boundary that's been established by the U.S. Geological Survey. And that essentially, and I'll show you a map of that, of what those limits are, but it expands out into Webb County. This map here, Zagate Creek is the watershed boundary in red, and the watershed boundary in orange is Manadas Creek. This shows the current effective FEMA floodplain maps based upon the best available information that we have, and that's the 2010. This is actually studies prior to that 2010, even in Zagate Creek. This is a map. This next figure is the study results of the 100-year estimated flood risk from the Zagate Creek watershed. So I'm going to flip back between these two, but one thing you should look at is the flooding extent. So again, this area in purple versus the area in blue on Zagate Creek, and you can see there's quite a bit difference in some areas of the estimated flood risk. The methods used in this 2010 study are dated, the engineering methods, and there's some better tools available called two-dimensional modeling that will allow us to better estimate flood risk once it leaves the channel and goes flooding through the streets and the storm sewer systems, etc. That was not able to be captured even in this 2010 study. This is ultimately the study limits, as you guys have seen. This not last slide, but this next slide, you can see the boundary in red, again, is Zagate Creek. The boundary in orange is Manadas Creek, and then there's this boundary, this black boundary, and that is the Huf10 Watershed. This is the area where we're going to be doing some public outreach out in Webb County to solicit feedback on any flood risk issues that may exist well outside of these primary focus points, so that this information can be gathered, disseminated to the Water Development Board, and then possibly future grant money may be available to Webb County or the city in other watersheds such as Chacon Creek or some of the others. The main focus of this project, again, is a drainage master plan, and by that we mean identifying flood control solutions. That's channel improvement projects, levees, regional detention ponds, flood warning improvements such as additional river gauge locations, maybe even real-time flood mapping that could be displayed on a website so that people can see the real-time flood risk as a rain event is occurring. This is just a little schematic of a typical cross-section of a channel as you have fill and improvements that are done, such as this little house that's shown on the left side, that impacts the floodplain. And in order to protect structures or to reduce that flood risk, channel widening or levees or different type of projects is ultimately going to be what's required to manage that flood risk long term. I know there's a lot of communities, and I know Laredo probably does it as well. Detention, on-site detention improvements, but something to keep in mind with on-site detention is that it does mitigate flood risk immediately downstream of those detention ponds, but it does not manage flood volume. And so it focuses primarily on managing peak flow. And one of the risks that communities will always run into is as development occurs, there's added impervious cover via pavement or building rooftops, and there's less of water that's able to infiltrate the soil. So there's an increase in volume. And there's very rarely do communities manage volume. They almost always focus on peak flow. And when you don't manage volume, you're going to always have an increase in flood risk along the floodplain. So one of the ways that we're going to help address that is not only look at an existing conditions estimate of flood risk, but we're also going to estimate a future conditions. Now that's not so much of an issue. I'm going to go back a couple of slides. That's not so much an issue on Zagate Creek because it's pretty well fully built out, except for maybe at the very upper headwater. But on Manadas Creek, there's still portions of the watershed that remain undeveloped that would be that we could estimate what those additional impervious cover may be, and then come up with a future conditions flood risk. The overall scope of this project, again, is we're trying to reach out to the community, identify existing flood risk in the outer area. We're also trying to identify flood risk within Manadas and Zagate Creek using engineering methods and calculations. Determine, are the FEMA flood maps accurate? I think we already know in Zagate Creek they're not. Probably it's going to be shown that the ones in Manadas Creek are not accurate as well. And then where can we do future flood control improvements? And that gets challenging in urban areas because you have limited right-of-way. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just concrete line the channel. Something to keep in mind when we look at alternatives for this project, we're not necessarily going to come up with solutions that will eliminate flood risk, but the goal will be to come up with cost-effective solutions that reduce flood risk. So we'll be looking at, okay, how many buildings get pulled out of the floodplain, or how many buildings get pulled out of a 25-year floodplain, and then what is that construction cost, and then come up with projects that have a positive benefit cost, primarily because that is the best way to achieve grant funding, both federal through FEMA, as well as through the Corps of Engineers, or even the state FIF program Category 2 funds. This is the project schedule that we have. Right now, the goal is to have this project complete by September 2023. So we kicked off this project about a month ago, or a month and a half ago. Our firm was selected through an RFQ process, I think back in November, December timeframe, and then we signed a contract in January, February, and we're soon going to be starting our field survey data collection, where we survey the various bridge structures and culvert crossings throughout the city. And then we're going to be starting our hydrologic analysis. That's where we come up with our detailed watershed boundary and subwatersheds, and ultimately come up with the peak flows for the 100-year event or 500-year event. And then we'll move into the hydraulic modeling. That's the two-dimensional modeling where we can simulate the flow, not only what's going down the main channels of these various watersheds, but once it overtops the banks and floods through the streets and winds its way in between buildings, where does that water go? That'll be followed by alternative analysis and benefit cost analysis, and then a draft report. We have 3 public meetings. This is the first of the 3. We'll have 2 more. The next public meeting will likely be coincide with the completion of the new H&H modeling, which ultimately is the new floodplain maps and flood risk areas that we are estimating from our models. Something to also keep in mind, we're going to be calibrating all of our results to historic flood events. So we'll be at some point looking to visit with the city, the county, the local community about any high water marks that are available from past flood events, that we can make sure our model is recreating those storm events accurately before we start looking at alternatives. The last public meeting will focus on, it'll be around September of 2023 or August. That last public meeting will be presenting the results of our study, which is the meat of it all being the alternatives that we identify, the rough cost estimates for them, the benefit cost ratios, and then identifying projects that the city could likely apply for future Category 2 FIF grant funds or FEMA grants. And that is that's the conclusion of my presentation.
Could you mute? Okay.
Yep. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. Is there any questions?
Did you say that you were going to consider a height marks for flooding, natural floodings, or not natural floodings like the last one we had? She opened the gates of the Amistad.
Yeah, so it could be both. If all we need to know is, if it's we'll call an unnatural flooding where, there was a release along the Rio Grande and it backed water up. That could be, if we are able to get some flow information for those releases, then we could see how that affects things. But something to keep in mind is if it's not a rainstorm, the Rio Grande will only back up so much. But our focus of this project is not the Rio Grande, it's the Manadas and Zagate Creek. So that Rio Grande effect would only, likely affect Manadas and Zagate Creek near their outfalls. So primarily the focus is going to be on rainfall events, and we're going to try to get, any historic rainfall or flood events on those watersheds. We want to get high water marks for, and any kind of records of what flooded, what buildings flooded, how deep. And then when we simulate we can actually recreate those storm events if they were within the last 20, 25 years because of NEXRAD radar data for those storm events that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has cataloged. So we can take those and we can recreate those storm events in our computer model and make sure that our model is replicating reality. Because we always recognize models are never perfect, but we want to make them useful, and the best way to do that is to calibrate them to real storm events. Anita, is there anything that you wanted to chime in on? Were you able to get your audio to work?
Yes.
Can you all hear me? I had to call in.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything particular to to this. I think it was a great presentation. Does anyone have any questions about TWDB or anything on our side?
Yes, there's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, for the flood predictions, are they able to end up having it where it would be like 5 to 10 feet more than they expected? You are using the aquatic oceanic radar, instead of just having it for the storms that we know of, since we know that our atmospheric pressure and everything is changing due to climate change. You might want to have it where it could be 5 to 10 feet more floods than the current rate, because our current rate is before we have more catastrophic climate change.
Right. The topic of climate change is very complex, and historically, flood risk analysis and drainage studies of this nature that FEMA have done or the Corps of Engineers have always been standing where we are and looking into the past and saying, okay, what happened in the past is that, let's get some statistics for rainfall in the past, for flood risk in the past, and then say, we'll project that into the future. It gets very challenging to have a good handle on how much the climate will change and how quickly. Will there be an additional, 1 inch of rainfall statistically, every month, or will it be much more severe? And I have yet to be able to find good literature or scientific studies that can well predict that. So what the Corps of Engineers many times, oh, we got some echo.
Yes.
What
It's mine.
Can everybody turn on the mic?
I'm trying to get it. I don't.
Got it? Okay, thank you.
Got it. I couldn't. Thank you.
Okay, so what the Corps of Engineers has recommended and other federal agencies is that whenever we design flood reduction solutions, we add freeboard. So for example, if we design a detention pond for 80 acre feet of storage, hey, let's add an additional 10 or 15% to that to account for future flood risk or climatic changes. Or if we build a levee and we say it needs to be 10 feet tall, maybe we make it 12 feet tall. Unfortunately, that's been the limited recommendations that I've been able to find by the federal government in order to handle that. But that is how we would handle it, is not necessarily in the modeling, but in the final recommendations that we give for flood reduction solution.
Sorry, y'all. I had got disconnected. Can I hear what the original question was?
My question,
The original question was about if a natural flooding events like the release of water from the Amistad
could be raised by 5 to 10 feet to account for climate change that could be a current event, since our temperature is of the current climate, but you're averaging out for 25 and 100 years. We might want to average out more footage that would be needed because of the climate and how it's constantly changing.
That was the second part of the second question.
Yes.
But the first one was about the release of water from the Amistad levee.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think when it comes to specifics like that, Eric answering the question earlier was more fitted. And I honestly think, like Eric mentioned earlier in his presentation, learning what the region, I believe it's Region 15 for Laredo, what they're doing as well when it comes to climate change and historic rainfall data would be useful and beneficial to tap into their meetings every month as well. Eric, I'm not sure if you have spoken to anyone over there or thought about attending the meeting, but I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. I will.
If you need a contact or if you want me to send you any like upcoming information about one of their meetings, I can do that.
Yes, please do.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Mr. Sheeb?
There's another question.
Cesar Rodriguez, sorry about that. I'm Cesar Rodriguez. For me, if you do a quick Google search, I'm just wondering, for the short term right now, before the project is able to be fully developed, for the short term, are they able to get in like inflatable directive barriers for flooding? There are a lot of them that they have on YouTube, and there's even some plastic ones that are made so they could direct flood water on the streets away from houses and direct it towards the river. There's also other areas like using barriers such as, if I'm not mistaken, in India, they're using hair as a barrier where we use hay, since hair is more permeable and water is able to pass through. And
Yeah, so, and you were cutting out a little bit, but it sounds like you were asking about some immediate solutions to flooding risk, and I think I'll defer to John or someone at the city on that one, because our focus is on this master plan.
We usually review development projects and blueprints, and we ask them to include best management practices, such as the one that you described,
thank you.
for individual projects and developments.
Just that's some kind of advice.